The factory floor had never looked so warm. Strings of golden lights shimmered above the worn metal rafters, casting a soft glow over the long tables lined with paper plates, half-eaten tamales, and store-bought sheet cake with gracias clara, piped in shaky icing. The break room radio had been hauled out and turned to a nostalgic bolero station, the tinny music barely audible over the buzz of laughter and clinking soda bottles. A makeshift banner hung crookedly near the time clock. 30 years of dedication. We love you, Clara. Clara Ruiz stood at the center of it all, her back a little straighter than usual, her shoulders hiding decades of strain beneath her neatly ironed blue blouse. Her silver-streaked hair was swept into a bun so tight it tugged at her temples, but it was her eyes, dark, heavy-lidded, constantly scanning the room, that betrayed her restlessness. She smiled politely as co-workers past and present came forward to hug her, thank her, share memories, how she taught them to fix a jammed press, how she covered shifts when someone's baby had a fever, how she always brought extra lunch. Some cried, some laughed, some just pressed wrinkled hands to her shoulders, the way people do when they don't quite know how to say goodbye. Her manager, Mr. Ellis, a stiff man with a face like curdled milk, gave a brief speech. 30 years ago, Clara Ruiz walked through those doors. She worked hard. She worked honest. She never once called out. Not once. He looked as if even that fact annoyed him somehow. We thank her for her service. Polite claps followed. Clara gave a modest nod. But just as someone was handing her a bouquet of grocery store flowers, the warehouse doors creaked open. A hush swept the room like a sudden draft. Heads turned. Conversations froze mid-laugh. Standing in the doorway, heels clicking against the concrete, lips pursed like a signature, was Isabel Ruiz. She was the kind of woman who brought her own silence with her. In a tailored cream blazer, black slacks without a wrinkle, and lipstick the color of betrayal, Isabel didn't look like she belonged in this world of overalls and oil-stained hands. And that, Clara thought bitterly, was probably the point. Clara's breath caught. Her spine stiffened. Isabel? Someone whispered, barely believing it. Mother and daughter stared at each other across decades of silence. No one clapped. No one dared. Congratulations, Isabel said, her voice smooth, rehearsed, transactional. I came to say that. She gestured vaguely at the banner, then folded her arms. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. Her fingers clutched the bouquet tighter, the plastic crinkling under the pressure. Thank you, she said finally, but her voice cracked on the second word. Around them, people shuffled awkwardly, murmurs rising like mist. The music played on, unaware that something raw had entered the room. Later, after the cake was sliced and the crowd began to thin, Clara sat alone at a folding table, staring at her untouched slice. Isabel stood across from her, not sitting, not leaving either. So, Isabel said, this is what 30 years gets you? Clara didn't look up. It gave you college. It gave you distance. And for a moment, Isabel had no clever retort. Outside, the sky turned lavender. Inside, two women, bound by blood but split by silence, shared a table, a moment, and a wound neither of them dared to reopen. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. After the party, Clara had insisted on walking home alone. The factory was only 6 blocks away, and she said she needed the air. Isabel hadn't argued. Truthfully, she didn't know how to. Not with a woman whose silence had always been louder than any reprimand. Now morning light filtered through faded lace curtains, catching dust in its golden beams. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee. Her fingers, stiff with arthritis, trembled slightly, not from age, but from memory. The letter sat folded, yellowing, fragile as moth wings in the inside pocket of her coat. She'd carried it for decades, across late-night bus rides, double shifts, lonely birthdays. It had survived rain, fire, guilt. She had once tried to burn it, but flames hesitated. Half of it blackened, but the rest refused to curl. She couldn't finish the job. Now on the morning after her retirement, with the echo of Isabel's voice still lingering in her ears, she held it again. Her eyes scanned the familiar script, blurred in places from water stains. Or were those tears once? The first few lines still stung. To my child. She folded it quickly, before she could slip again into that dangerous place. She pressed the letter back into her coat pocket and buttoned it shut like a secret. Upstairs, Isabel stirred in the guest room, the first time she'd stayed overnight since she was a teenager. Her suitcase remained zipped. Her perfume lingered in the hallway like a challenge. She didn't belong in this house anymore, not with its faded wallpaper and squeaky floorboards, but she was here for now. Downstairs, Clara stood and washed her mug, even though it was already clean. She scrubbed and rinsed and scrubbed again, as if it could drown the memory. When she turned to hang her coat, the letter slipped out unnoticed, fluttering gently to the floor like a fallen petal. Isabel found it later that morning. She had come downstairs expecting silence and passive-aggressive civility. Instead, she found the kitchen empty and Clara already gone. Vanished before sunrise, apparently, to the market or the pharmacy. But it was the small, brittle piece of paper lying beside the coat rack that stopped Isabel cold. She picked it up cautiously, as if it might disintegrate in her hands. The top corner was scorched, the handwriting shaky but familiar, Clara's. She sat down at the kitchen table, her breath shallow. To my child. The words that followed were jagged, unfinished, aching. There were references to a time before Isabel, a boy I couldn't keep, and the lie I never corrected. Clara's voice came alive on the page, raw, uncertain, nothing like the woman who wore pride like armor. Isabel read the letter twice, then a third time, each pass peeling back another layer of shock. It wasn't just the mention of another child, it was the tone. Not defensive, not regretful, just broken. She folded the letter with trembling fingers, stared at the refrigerator covered in faded magnets and prayer cards, and whispered, "Who were you before me, Mom?" But the house, as always, gave no answer. The tension in the living room was like a held breath, tight, barely restrained, and ready to snap. Clara sat on the worn couch, her posture stiff, eyes focused on the blank television screen. Isabel stood near the mantel, clutching the half-burnt letter like a legal document. She didn't raise her voice, but each word was sharp, precise. "You had another child," she said, "and you never told me." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't deny it either. Her hands resting in her lap curled into fists. "That was a long time ago," Clara said softly. Isabel shook her head. "Why does that matter? You had a son. Before me. You hid that from me my entire life." Clara's lips pressed into a line. "Because it wasn't your burden." Isabel laughed bitterly. "No? And what exactly is this?" She waved the letter in the air. "Because it sure feels like a burden now." The silence that followed was not peaceful. It throbbed between them, thick with years of unsaid things. Clara stood, slowly, her knees cracking under the motion. "There are things you can't understand," she murmured. "Not yet. Try me." But Clara turned away, disappearing into her bedroom like a retreating shadow. Isabel stood alone in the silence, the words, "Not yet," echoing in her ears like a slammed door. Later that evening, after Clara had gone to bed early, claiming a headache, Isabel couldn't sleep. She wandered the dim hallways of the house she once called home, drawn to her mother's room by an uneasy gravity. The door was ajar, the soft sound of Clara's breathing drifting out like a fragile lullaby. The room was small, neatly kept, but cluttered with decades of living, stacked books, rosary beads, framed photos. On a bookshelf, a worn manila folder stuck out between two old hymnals. Isabel hesitated, then pulled it free. Inside were medical documents, faded and creased from handling. Hospital records, prescriptions, a few handwritten notes. She flipped through until one page caught her eye, a discharge form, dated months before Isabel's birth. Her fingers froze on the name listed under next of kin. Matias Elias Vargas. The name meant nothing at first. Then her heart began to race. Slowly, like a faucet drip of memory, she remembered the way Clara always changed the subject when asked about her father. How she never showed pictures. How she'd said he died. when Isabel was too young to remember. She read the name again, Matthias Elias Vargas. Alive enough, it seemed, to sign hospital paperwork. Alive enough to be real. Isabel sat down on the edge of her childhood bed and stared at the name, the ink faded, but undeniable. Her throat felt tight, not with anger, but with the sudden weight of questions. Had he really died? Or had Clara lied? And if she had, was Matthias still alive? Still nearby? Still watching? The folder slipped from her lap and landed on the floor with a dull thump, but Clara didn't stir. Isabel sat in the dark, her heart pounding in her ears, staring at the door like someone was about to walk through it. Someone with her eyes, her smile, her blood. The morning after Isabel found the hospital file, the world felt different. Quieter, thinner, as if the veil between the past and present had been disturbed, and the weight of decades had shifted just enough to let the truth seep through. Clara was still asleep, pale and worn from the previous night's confrontation. Isabel stood in the kitchen, sipping coffee she didn't taste, staring at the folded discharge paper on the counter. Matthias Elias Vargas. The name echoed in her mind like a haunting tune. She needed answers, and she knew Clara wouldn't give them willingly, so she took another path. The factory looked almost unrecognizable in daylight, gritty, utilitarian, stripped of last night's celebration. Isabel hadn't set foot there since she was a teenager. The machinery still hummed, a chorus of labor and routine, and the scent of oil and metal clung to the air like memory. She asked for someone who might remember Clara from the early years. That's how she found Magda Peña, a retired floor supervisor now volunteering part-time in the front office. Magda had been Clara's friend, or at least her confidant, the kind of woman who carried stories like scars. At first, Magda was guarded, even amused. "Corporate girl coming back to dig in the dirt, huh?" "I'm not here for gossip," Isabel replied. "I'm here for the truth about my mother." Something in her tone shifted Magda's expression. She glanced at the closed door, then gestured for Isabel to follow her into a storage room filled with file boxes and rusted clipboards. "I knew one day someone would come looking," Magda muttered. "Didn't expect it to be you." Isabel stayed quiet. Magda sat on a folding chair as if steadying herself before releasing something long buried. "Your mother, she wasn't just a good worker. She was desperate when she started here. Quiet, proud, but always watching the door, like she was waiting for someone who never came." Isabel's stomach tightened. Was she hiding? Magda nodded. "Not from the law. From life, maybe. She showed up with nothing but a duffel bag and a baby bump she tried to hide with loose clothes. That child, your brother, was born right after she started, but he didn't stay. The air between them cracked open like dry ice and warm water." "What do you mean?" Isabel asked, voice low. Magda's gaze grew distant. "She paid someone to take him. A woman on the line, a widow named Teresa, who couldn't have children of her own. It wasn't official, not through the courts. Just a few signatures, some cash under the table, and silence. Clara made it clear. No one was to speak of it again." Isabel's breath caught. "Why? Why would she do that?" "Survival," Magda said flatly. "She couldn't raise 2 kids. She was already working double shifts to stay afloat. And there was shame, the kind women carry alone. She didn't want you growing up in that shadow." Isabel took a shaky step back. "And no one said anything?" "Not until now." Magda hesitated, then added, "That boy, he didn't leave town. Teresa stayed here until she passed. And the child, he grew up around us, went to local schools. He could have stood next to you in line at the grocery store, for all you know." The weight of those words slammed into Isabel like a freight train. Her brother, a living, breathing person, might have been right beside her all these years. A stranger wearing her blood, a ghost her mother never named. "Do you know his name?" she asked. Magda only shook her head. "No." That part Clara kept to herself. She burned the past like old paper. All we had left were the ashes. That night, Isabel sat at Clara's bedside again, her mother dozing restlessly under a knit blanket. The television played a muted sitcom, the room dim but warm. Isabel studied Clara's face. Lined, quiet, guarded even in sleep. "You gave him away," she whispered, not with anger but awe. "And you lived every day pretending you didn't." Clara stirred slightly but didn't wake. Isabel's heart ached, not just for the secrets, but for the reasons behind them. Poverty, judgment, survival, love twisted into sacrifice. And now, the question haunting her thoughts refused to be ignored. Have I already met him? The house was too quiet. It had been 2 days since Isabel learned of her brother, her mother's secret son, and still, the silence between her and Clara was thick and impenetrable. Clara moved through the house like a shadow of herself, sipping lukewarm tea, folding laundry she had already folded twice, avoiding Isabel's eyes as though a single glance might shatter what little ground they had left to stand on. Isabel watched her from the hallway that morning, unnoticed. Clara's shoulders slumped forward as she moved from the kitchen to the living room. She looked impossibly small in her threadbare sweater, her slippers dragging slightly as if she'd forgotten how to lift her feet. The once formidable woman who had ruled a factory floor for 30 years now looked like she might blow away with the next breeze. The clink of ceramic against tile startled them both. The mug had slipped from Clara's hand. It shattered into jagged white pieces across the kitchen floor, coffee splattering like spilled ink. Isabel rushed to her side. "Mom?" Clara didn't respond. Her knees buckled. Time slowed. Isabel caught her just before her head hit the tile, cradling her mother's limp body as panic surged through her chest like fire. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and dread. Isabel sat alone in the hallway, hands bloodied from a cut she'd gotten on the broken mug, heart pounding from the sprint through admissions and forms and fluorescent chaos. Doctors spoke in clipped terms, nurses moved with precision, but everything felt muffled to Isabel, like she was underwater and watching her life from behind glass. The moment she'd feared since childhood, the moment of losing the one person who'd always, somehow, been there, had arrived without ceremony. After what felt like hours, a doctor emerged. "She's stable," he said. "Exhaustion, dehydration, possibly a stress-induced collapse. She needs rest, real rest." Isabel nodded blankly. As the doctor walked away, a nurse handed her a small plastic bag of Clara's belongings, her house keys, wallet, reading glasses, and a folded slip of yellowed paper that had fallen out of her coat pocket during intake. Isabel stared at it for a long moment before opening it. It was an old prescription slip, faded ink, almost illegible. But the name scrawled at the bottom was unmistakable. Dr. Matias Vargas. Her father. Isabel's hand trembled. How long had Clara been holding on to this? Had she kept it like a charm, a burden, a talisman? Was it guilt, love, regret? She looked toward the closed door of Clara's hospital room, her mother sleeping just beyond it, small and fragile beneath white sheets. And for the first time in her life, Isabel felt something terrifyingly close to fear, not of death, but of inheritance, not of loss, but of legacy. Back in the hospital room, she watched Clara sleep, IV dripping rhythmically beside her. "You always carried everything alone," Isabel whispered, voice catching. "But not anymore. Whatever this is, whatever's still buried, I'm digging it up. I have to." Outside, the sun was beginning to rise. A pale golden light filtered through the blinds and warmed the edges of Clara's face. She looked peaceful. But Isabel knew better now. Even in rest, her mother was laboring. The hospital room was dark when Isabel returned that evening. Clara still hadn't stirred. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitored the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. Isabel didn't know what she was hoping for. Maybe that her mother would wake up and offer an explanation, or maybe just to see her chest rise and fall in the steady, familiar rhythm of life. Instead, Clara lay as she had all day, pale, fragile, her face barely illuminated by the dim glow of the overhead lights. Isabel sighed, stepping into the small side room where Clara's personal belongings had been stashed. The folded prescription slip had been left on the counter in a sterile plastic bag, but something else had caught Isabel's attention. A photo album, buried beneath layers of old magazines and unopened letters. She opened it carefully, her fingertips brushing the worn leather cover. It was the kind of album that people never fully let go of, a relic of a past they were both proud of and terrified of. Isabel turned the pages slowly, scanning the faded snapshots of Clara's youth. A wedding photo. A picture of her standing proudly in front of the factory gates, arms crossed, wearing a look of fierce determination. But then, there it was. The photo that stopped her breath in her chest. A picture of Clara, younger, perhaps in her late 20s, beaming at the camera, her arm wrapped around the shoulders of a man Isabel didn't recognize. He had shaggy dark hair, a strong jawline, and a broad smile. They looked happy, intimate even. The kind of closeness that seemed impossible now, between her and Clara. Isabel stared at the man's face. There was something eerily familiar about him, though she couldn't place it. She turned the photo over, hoping for some clue, perhaps a date, a name, anything, nothing. Just the old imprint of ink that was now too faded to read. Isabel felt a chill creep over her skin. She pulled the album closer, examining every angle of the photo. Why was this man with my mother, she thought. There was a connection there, one that Clara had clearly wanted to hide. And then the nurse walked in. "How's she doing?" the nurse asked, her voice soft but professional. Isabel didn't answer right away. Her eyes lingered on the photograph. "Who's this man?" Isabel asked, pointing at the image. The nurse's gaze flicked to the photo, then back to Isabel. She froze, her expression briefly hardening before she masked it with a practiced smile. "Oh, that's someone from the old days. A volunteer. I think he helped out in the children's ward. A kind man. I don't remember his name offhand, but he was always there when the kids needed him." A volunteer? In the children's ward? Isabel's pulse quickened, her suspicion rising. She couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to the story, more than just an old acquaintance from Clara's past. "Did you ever see him with my mother?" Isabel asked, watching the nurse closely. The nurse hesitated. The briefest flicker of recognition passed through her eyes, but she quickly suppressed it. "I couldn't say," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "But your mother, she knew everyone here, very involved with the families." Isabel didn't buy it. There was something off about the nurse's sudden detachment. She could feel the threads of a deeper secret unraveling before her. The man in the photo hadn't just been a volunteer. He had been part of Clara's life in a way Isabel had never imagined, intimately, perhaps even more than a friend. And the more Isabel stared at the photograph, the more it seemed to haunt her. His smile, his closeness with Clara. There was something about him that lingered in her thoughts, gnawing at the edges of her mind. But it wasn't until later that night, long after the nurse had left, that Isabel would hear something that would make her blood run cold. Isabel had slipped into the hallway for a brief breath of fresh air, trying to shake off the weight of the day. As she passed the nurse's station, she overheard a conversation between two hospital staff members. Their voices were low, but their words carried. "Did you see the volunteer in the children's ward?" "He came in today," one nurse said. "Yeah, I saw him," the other nurse replied. "Looks just like that guy who used to work here." "Daniel, right? You know, from back in the day. What's he up to now?" Isabel's heart stopped. "Daniel? That's him," the first nurse responded. "He's been volunteering here for years. I think he's still working around the area. Just saw him yesterday, actually." Isabel's head spun. "Daniel?" The name from the photo, the name from her mother's past. It couldn't be a coincidence. The man she had been staring at in the photograph, the man who had seemed so familiar, was still here. Still in the building. Isabel's thoughts raced. If this man, Daniel, was so intertwined with Clara's past, then maybe he held the missing pieces of the puzzle. He might know things her mother had buried, things that could unlock the secrets that had been weighing on both of them for so long. Isabel knew what she had to do next. The photo, the mysterious man, the hushed conversations, everything was connected, and this was only the beginning. The next day, Isabel could think of nothing else but the photograph and the name that had echoed in her mind all night. Daniel. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the picture, the one with his arm around her mother in such a familiar, affectionate way, was more than just a passing acquaintance from Clara's past. His connection to Clara, to Isabel's own history, was becoming too clear to ignore. As soon as she could, Isabel returned to the hospital, her steps quick and determined. The sun outside had broken through the usual overcast skies, but the heaviness in her chest remained. She walked straight to the children's ward, where she had overheard the nurses talking about Daniel the night before. The familiar white walls, the faint scent of antiseptic, and the low hum of distant conversations did nothing to ease her growing anxiety. There, just as the nurse had described, was Daniel. He was standing by a small group of children, handing out balloons to the young patients in the ward. He wore a faded blue janitor's uniform, his movements methodical and quiet. It was the same uniform he had been wearing in the photograph, but the man now was older, grayer, his youthful energy replaced with a calm, steady presence. Yet there was something about his demeanor that made Isabel pause. It was as though he had stepped out of her past, a ghost from a life she never knew existed. She approached him cautiously, unsure of what to say. The closer she got, the more her heart raced. He was smiling at the children, laughing softly at their jokes, but when he caught sight of Isabel, his expression faltered. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she thought he might walk away. But then he didn't. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle but laced with curiosity. He was watching her with a calm, almost wary gaze, but there was something warm in his eyes. He didn't seem frightened, just cautious. Isabel swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind 100 times, but now that she was standing here, the words seemed to stick in her throat. "Are you Daniel?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Daniel? From the photograph?" He blinked, his brow furrowing slightly, and his hand, which had been holding a balloon, lowered slowly. "A photograph?" He looked around, as though searching for an answer in the air around them. "I don't know what you mean. What photograph?" Isabel felt a pang of frustration, but she masked it quickly. She didn't want to push him too hard. Instead, she pulled the photograph out of her bag, the one of her mother, Clara, and the young man smiling together, and handed it to him. Daniel's eyes shifted over the image, and for a brief, disconcerting moment, Isabel saw a flicker of recognition, a brief flicker that disappeared as quickly as it came. He held the photo in both hands, his thumb gently brushing the edge of the frame, before looking up at Isabel. "That's a photo of my mother," Isabel said, her voice cracking slightly as she watched his reaction. "Is this you?" Daniel's gaze dropped to the photo again, and then back to Isabel, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He nodded slowly, as though processing something heavy, something that had long been buried. "It's me," he said quietly. That's me in the photo. I don't remember much from that time, but yes, that's me." Isabel's mind was racing. He knew. He recognized the photo. But there was still so much more to uncover. "Why did my mother have a picture of you? You weren't just a volunteer, were you?" Daniel hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the photo. He looked at the children in the ward, almost as if trying to gather the strength to speak. Finally, after a long silence, he took a deep breath. "You should sit down," he said, his voice low and guarded. "This isn't something I've ever really talked about." Isabel nodded, heart pounding. She could feel the weight of the moment. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and she wasn't sure she was ready to hear what came next. They found a bench by the window, and Daniel sat down beside her, still holding the photo in his hands. He didn't speak for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "My mother, she wasn't the person I thought she was," Daniel began, his eyes flickering between the photo and Isabel. "I always believed the man who raised me was my father. He told me that my real father had died before I was born. But I never knew the truth, not until recently." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced. Could this man be the key to everything? Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A few months ago, I found out that the man I thought was my father wasn't, and that the truth was much more complicated than I ever imagined. Your mother knew my real father. She was involved with him, and the photo, it was from a time when we were both part of something we couldn't see, a connection we didn't understand." Isabel's world seemed to tilt. This man was connected to her mother. and to her in ways she hadn't even begun to comprehend. "Your mother was—" Daniel faltered, his eyes clouded with emotions he wasn't ready to voice. "She was there for me when I needed her most. But she wasn't the person I thought she was. She had secrets. So many secrets." Isabel's mind was spinning. She didn't know whether to feel betrayed, angry, or just utterly lost. The man beside her, this stranger who had been part of her mother's life, was more than just a ghost from the past. He was her brother. Isabel's head was spinning with the new revelations Daniel had shared. The photo, the letter, the fragments of memories she couldn't quite piece together. And now, as Daniel sat across from her, revealing his own history of secrets, the fabric of her life was beginning to unravel before her eyes. They were sitting in a small cafe, the hum of soft conversations and clinking dishes in the background. But to Isabel, it was as though the world outside had ceased to exist. She barely registered the waiters passing by, her focus entirely on Daniel. She needed answers, answers that seemed just beyond her reach. "You don't understand," Daniel said, his voice tight, barely above a whisper. His fingers drummed on the edge of his coffee cup, an unconscious rhythm to his nerves. "The man who raised me, he wasn't my father." Isabel leaned in, her breath catching. This was the moment. She had been waiting for it, wanting it, needing it to explain everything. Her father. The one Clara had never spoken of. "All my life I believed the man who took care of me, loved me, was my father," Daniel continued, his voice laced with bitterness, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But when I was older, I found out that the man who raised me wasn't the one who had any right to. He wasn't my father, the man I'm searching for. He's my real father." Isabel felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't possible. Her thoughts were muddled. Everything about her mother, about her childhood, was now in question. She thought back to the hospital record she had found in Clara's things, the name on the discharge papers. It couldn't be. Could it? Her voice was hoarse, struggling to make sense of what she was hearing. "So, this man you're searching for, is he someone my mother knew?" Daniel looked down at the table, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. The silence stretched between them, as though he were gathering the strength to continue. Isabel could see the pain in his eyes, the lingering grief that had shaped his life. "Yes," Daniel said softly. "It's someone your mother knew very well." He swallowed hard, then added, almost as an afterthought, "In fact, he's someone I think you might know too." Isabel felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes flickered toward the door, as though he might flee if he said the wrong thing. He took a deep breath and leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper. "His name is Luis Sandoval." Isabel froze. The name hit her like a thunderclap, a jagged bolt of lightning in the middle of the quiet cafe. Luis Sandoval, the name from her mother's hospital record, the name that had always seemed so distant, so unreal. But it was real, too real. It was her father. She didn't say anything for a long moment, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. Luis Sandoval was alive. Her mind reeled. For years, Clara had told her that her father had died in an accident when she was just a baby. She had always believed that lie, trusted her mother's words, but now, sitting across from Daniel, Isabel realized that nothing was as it seemed. "How do you know him?" Isabel managed to whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel took a long, shaky breath. "I was told that Luis Sandoval was dead too, but the more I dug, the more I realized that was a lie. He's been alive all these years, and I've been looking for him." Isabel's mind was racing. Her father, the man she thought was dead, hadn't only been alive, he had been watching them from the shadows, from a distance. And now, Isabel realized, he had been part of her life all along. The pieces began to fall into place, things she hadn't understood before, the gaps, the silences, the things her mother never said. Luis Sandoval wasn't just a man from her past, he was a part of her family, a part of her history, and her mother, Clara, had kept him hidden. All this time. Why? Isabel finally found her voice. Why did my mother keep him from me? Why didn't she ever tell me about him? Why didn't she? Daniel's face was soft with sympathy. He seemed to understand her pain, her confusion. It wasn't her choice, Isabel. She didn't want to hide it from you. She was forced to. The truth wasn't something she could ever give you. Not without breaking you too. His words hung heavy in the air. Isabel didn't know what to say. She felt torn in 1,000 directions, emotions crashing through her like a storm. Anger, betrayal, confusion, but most of all, an overwhelming sense of loss. Her entire life had been built on the foundation of a lie. "Do you think he's still out there?" Isabel asked, almost pleading, her voice cracking. "Do you think my father is still out there too?" Daniel paused. He locked eyes with her, his expression one of quiet resolution. "I don't know, but I intend to find him. And when I do, Isabel, I think you should meet him. He's your father, and he's been waiting all these years to explain himself. He owes you that much." Isabel was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Luis Sandoval, her father, was out there somewhere, and now she had to find him. The boardroom felt colder than usual. Isabel sat at the far end of the long glass table, surrounded by colleagues who were more focused on quarterly projections than on the storm building inside her. Her mind wasn't on profits or reports. It was on a name, Luis Sandoval, a name she couldn't stop hearing in the back of her mind since Daniel had spoken it. She tapped her pen, her eyes flickering to the large portrait on the far wall. It was the only image of the founder of Sandoval Industries, shadowed in gold, his expression enigmatic. Most employees had never met him. He rarely appeared in public, preferring to run things from a distance through a circle of intermediaries and board members. People called him a visionary, a genius recluse. Isabel had always found the secrecy odd, but now it struck a raw nerve. When the meeting adjourned, she didn't return to her office. Instead, she moved quickly through the executive wing, bypassing the assistant's curious glances as she made her way to the secure archives. Very few had access to the company's legacy files, but Isabel was one of them. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed in her credentials. The screen blinked. She searched for Luis Sandoval. Files popped up, mostly scanned documents, legal papers, business filings, but one folder caught her eye: Founder, Confidential HR Archive. She opened it. There, in a dusty scan of a decades-old corporate ID badge, was a name and photo that made her breath hitch. She leaned closer. The face. The man in the photograph. The same man from Clara's old photo album. The same man who had once stood beside her mother, smiling, years before Isabel was born. It was him, Luis Sandoval. The world tilted. Her father hadn't just been alive all this time, he had been running the very company she now worked for. Her entire career had been spent unknowingly following in his footsteps. His name was on every wall, his presence in every memo. He had been orchestrating everything, watching her like a ghost in the wires. She scrolled further. There were communications flagged with board-only labels. One message, dated just 6 months earlier, stopped her cold. 2. L.Sandoval@si-holdings.com. From Executive Liaison, Internal Affairs. Your daughter continues to exceed performance expectations. Should we begin the next phase of mentorship? Or maintain current distance? Isabel clutched the edge of the desk, bile rising in her throat. He knew. He always knew. Luis had kept her at arm's length, moving her like a piece on a chessboard. Had he known about Clara's suffering? About Isabel's loneliness? Had he watched her climb the corporate ladder, secretly proud or merely calculating? She stood in the flickering light of the archive room, the enormity of it all pressing down on her chest. She was the daughter of a factory worker and a ghost king. A woman raised in a modest home by a mother who scrubbed machines and packed boxes, while her father sat in an ivory tower, hiding behind email chains and security walls. Why hadn't he come forward? Was it shame? Cowardice? Or something else entirely? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard again. She dug deeper, opening encrypted memos, old HR files, One phrase kept repeating in internal summaries tied to Luis: no familial disclosure. Maintain plausible deniability. Isabel backed away from the terminal. It wasn't just neglect. It was intentional. He had kept her in the dark, chosen to be a stranger in her life. And now that she knew, really knew, the rage boiling inside her mixed with sorrow, betrayal, and something darker. This wasn't just a family secret anymore. It was a legacy built on silence. She exited the archives, her steps slower, heavier. The polished walls of the corporate tower now felt like a cage. Every hallway echoed with the weight of a truth no one else could hear. Every smiling coworker was unknowingly part of the lie. As the elevator doors closed around her, Isabel stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, her power suit, her poised stance, her commanding presence. She looked just like the executive she had worked so hard to become, but now she knew who she really was: the daughter of Clara Ruiz, and Luis Sandoval's child. And somewhere out there, possibly in this very building, he was watching. The hospital room was still, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm has passed but before the sun dares to rise. The fluorescent lights buzzed low overhead, and the muted beeping of machines marked time like a ticking clock counting down moments too precious to waste. Clara Ruiz lay in the bed, her frame smaller than Isabel remembered, her face pale but peaceful. Tubes ran from her arms and a thin nasal cannula hissed quietly with oxygen. The Mother's Day morning sun peeked in through the slats of the blinds, casting long golden lines across the room floor like bars, like time was holding them all in place for this reckoning. Isabel stood by the window, holding a small bouquet of carnations. It felt stupid now, the way people try to patch over decades of pain with a greeting card and flowers. Beside her stood Daniel, quiet and tentative, the DNA results still echoing in his heart. The silence between them was not awkward, but reverent, two siblings standing on the threshold of something bigger than either had imagined. Clara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, clouded with fatigue but sharp enough to see them. "You both came," she said, voice thin as thread. Isabel walked closer and set the flowers down. She took her mother's frail hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Daniel followed, his expression unreadable, until Clara turned her eyes to him. "I know who you are," she whispered, a single tear sliding down the side of her face. "I always knew what I'd done." Daniel nodded slowly. "I only found out recently. About everything." Isabel told me. Clara looked between them as if trying to memorize their faces. "I should have told you both years ago. I thought I was protecting you." But silence turned into shame, and shame turned into distance. Isabel's voice cracked. "Why, Mommy? Why didn't you tell me he was alive? That I had a brother? That my whole life was only half the truth?" Clara's chest rose with a shallow breath. "Because I was afraid that the truth would make you love me less." The air went still again. "I was young," Clara said, her voice gaining a flicker of strength. "Barely 20. The factory job was supposed to be temporary. But then I got pregnant. Luis. He said he couldn't be tied down, that his future was too big for a family. He gave me hush money and disappeared." Isabel clenched her fists, biting back tears. "But then you met someone else?" Clara shook her head. "There was no one else, just survival. I gave birth to your brother in secret. I had no choice. I paid a coworker's cousin to adopt him. I wanted to check in over the years, but I thought it was selfish to try. And then, when I got pregnant again, with you, I swore I'd never make the same mistakes." Daniel sat down in the chair beside the bed. "But you kept working in that factory." "I had to. For the insurance. For the income. And because part of me thought, maybe one day you'd both find me, that I'd have something worth offering you besides regret." Tears streamed down Isabel's face now, unashamed. "Mammy, you didn't need to offer us anything. We just needed you." Daniel reached over and took Clara's other hand. "I grew up thinking I was no one. That I didn't matter. But you gave me life. You gave me this sister." Clara smiled weakly, her lips trembling. And you gave me peace. Both of you. Being here now, it's more than I deserve. No, Isabel said firmly. You gave up everything for us. That's what you deserve to be remembered for. Not the lies, not the silence, but the love. They sat there, the three of them, hands intertwined. A triangle of connection reformed after decades of fracture. Just then, the door opened gently. A nurse peeked in with a clipboard, hesitated, and then smiled. I'll give you more time, she whispered, backing out softly. Clara leaned back into her pillow. You two have each other now. Promise me. No more silence. No more shame. We promise, Isabel said, squeezing her hand. Daniel echoed. We promise. Outside, church bells began to ring in the distance. It was Sunday morning, Mother's Day. A day meant for brunches, cards, flowers. But in this room, it meant something different. It meant forgiveness. It meant truth. It meant the end of hiding. Clara closed her eyes, a smile ghosting her lips. The machine still hummed. The beeping continued. For now. Isabel and Daniel sat quietly by her side, not afraid of what would come next. Because no matter how fractured the past had been, the truth, finally spoken, had stitched them back together. Love, after all, was never measured by perfection. It was measured by sacrifice. And Clara Ruiz had given them everything.